What if one girl's quiet stand in a cafeteria shattered years of silence at an elite school? She didn't yell. She didn't fight. She just spoke. And suddenly, everything changed. They said Dalton Heights was inclusive, progressive, a place for future leaders. Zahara Brooks knew better. The school crest might have had diversity etched into its slogan, but between the marble hallways and legacy plaques, she walked like a shadow no one wanted to acknowledge. Dalton wasn't built for girls like her. It was inherited, not earned. And no matter how many honors she stacked or how many trophies she brought home from debate competitions, one truth always found her in the silence. They saw her, but they didn't see her. Especially not Trent Whitmore. Third-generation Dalton, lacrosse captain, grandson of the guy the science wing was named after. He didn't just walk through the school. He owned the air around him. And if there was one thing Trent hated more than being challenged, it was being challenged by someone who wasn't supposed to be in his world. The cafeteria was buzzing as Zahara stepped in, tray in hand, avoiding the usual glances, the ones that lingered too long. She moved to her usual spot, the far side, next to the window no one liked because of the glare. That's when she heard him. "Well, look who's back for seconds." Trent's voice rang out, loud enough to turn heads. He was halfway across the room, but his voice traveled like a thrown stone. Zahara froze for half a beat, then kept walking. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn. But the laughter from his table sliced straight through her back. "I'm surprised they let you stay after orientation," he added. "Did your scholarship forget to expire?" More snickers, the kind that weren't brave enough to be said face to face, but always found courage in numbers. Zahara sat. She didn't say a word. Not yet. She'd been through this before. Every day, it chipped at her just a little. Every joke, every stare, every whispered diversity pick. They didn't even hide it anymore. But today, something felt different. Not outside. Inside her. Like something had been sitting in silence for too long, and it wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. She picked up her juice box, popped the straw in, and took a slow sip. Eyes forward. Shoulders relaxed. But inside, a storm was forming, and she was tired of pretending it wasn't hers to unleash. Trent's voice didn't stop. That was the thing about boys like him. They pushed just to see how far they could go before someone pushed back. And Zahara? She'd spent years trying not to give them the satisfaction. But silence had its limits. "You know," he said, voice rising, "we should name a table after you. Charity Corner. You and the other applications the admissions office felt bad about." The air shifted. Zahara set her fork down, deliberately, gently, like someone preparing for surgery. Then, without looking up, she replied, "Is that the best you've got, Trent?" It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. Her tone cut through the laughter like glass slicing through velvet. The chatter around them dimmed, one voice at a time. She looked up. He wasn't used to that, being looked at like he was the one who should explain himself. Trent blinked, then smirked, just saying what everyone's thinking. "This isn't some community center, Zahara. This is Dalton." She stood slowly, her tray untouched, her voice calm. "And yet, I'm still here. Isn't that something?" A few students shifted uncomfortably. Others watched like they were waiting for a car crash. "I got here the same way you didn't," she said. "I earned it." Now he stood too. "Don't act like you belong here just because you passed a few tests. My family helped build this school." "Right," Zahara said, folding her arms. "And what exactly did you build? Aside from that overinflated ego you carry like a trust fund." A gasp rippled. Even Trent's smirk twitched. Just then a voice cut in, firm, deliberate. "Is there a reason I'm hearing raised voices all the way from the hall?" Principal Darnell had entered the cafeteria, tall, composed, with a stare that could stop a riot mid-sprint. He looked from Trent to Zahara, then at the frozen students. "Care to explain what's going on?" he asked. Trent opened his mouth to speak. Probably some smooth, family name saves the day excuse, but Zahara beat him to it. "Just a conversation, sir," she said evenly, "about who belongs here and who thinks they get to decide." Principal Darnell narrowed his eyes. And in that pause, something else shifted. Not just in the room. In Zahara. For the first time, she wasn't just reacting. She was leading. Principal Darnell's eyes stayed on Zahara longer than expected. He wasn't the kind to pick sides without facts. But he'd been at Dalton Heights long enough to read a room, and this room was humming with tension. "Ms. Brooks," he said carefully, "you're not in trouble. I'd just like to understand what happened." Trent jumped in like a wind-up toy. "It's nothing, sir. Just some friendly debate. You know how it gets in the cafeteria." Zahara didn't look at him. She looked at Principal Darnell, steady and measured. "He called me a charity case. Suggested I didn't belong here," she said. Loud enough for the whole room to hear. Darnell's face didn't move. "Did he now?" Zahara nodded. And when I responded, suddenly I was the problem. The silence that followed was different this time. Not heavily charged. Trent shifted. "I didn't mean anything by it. Everyone jokes." "This wasn't a joke," Zahara cut in. "It never is. You just think it is because people laugh." The principal turned to Ms. Connie, the cafeteria manager, who had been silently watching from behind the counter like a witness waiting to be asked. "Ms. Connie," he said. She gave a sharp nod. "I heard everything. And Zahara's right. That boy's mouth has been running since he walked in." Darnell's face changed, just enough. His jaw tightened. "Thank you." Then he turned to Trent. "I believe your grandfather once said that legacy without integrity is just vanity," Darnell said. "Maybe it's time you sat with that for a while." Trent blinked. "Sir, you're banned from the cafeteria for 2 weeks. Perhaps a few brown bag lunches will give you some perspective." A few gasps. A lot of wide eyes. Trent's face burned red. "You're kidding." "I'm not." Darnell's voice was like closing steel. Zahara didn't smile. She didn't flinch. She simply picked up her tray and walked past Trent, pausing only for a second. "You were saying something about earning your spot?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. Zahara kept walking. It wasn't triumph she felt. Not exactly. It was clarity, the kind that only comes after years of doubt, after fighting to breathe in a room where the air was never meant for you. And for the first time at Dalton Heights, she didn't feel like she was surviving. She felt like she was seen. The cafeteria didn't erupt. It didn't applaud. That kind of justice wasn't loud. It lingered. Zahara moved to her usual table, sat down, and quietly opened her carton of milk like nothing had happened. But the air was different now. Sharper, cleaner, like the first breath after a storm. She didn't need eyes on her to know they were there. Some curious, some stunned, a few admiring. But for once, none of them were mocking. Across the room, Trent sat alone near the vending machines, arms crossed tight, his face hard but pale. Stripped of his throne, he looked smaller. Not just in stature, but in meaning. Lena Morales slid into the seat across from Zahara without asking. "You good?" she asked softly. Zahara didn't answer right away. She stared out the window instead, the one no one liked. The sun had shifted. Its glare was softer now. "I'm not sure," she said finally. "I thought I'd feel proud." Lena tilted her head. "And you don't." Zahara shook her head. "I feel like I won something but lost something else. I'm tired." Lena leaned in. "Z, you didn't start that fire. You just refused to keep getting burned." That landed. Maybe Zahara had been waiting her whole life for someone to say that out loud. "Still," Zahara murmured, "I didn't want it to be a moment. I wanted it to be a beginning." Lena smirked. "Then don't let it end here." Zahara looked down at her tray, barely touched. The food tasted like nothing today, but her voice had finally meant something. That was more filling than any meal. Students had stopped whispering. Some were actually nodding at her as they walked past. A few even smiled. Not in pity, in respect. Funny how the same hallway could feel completely different after just one sentence. As the bell rang and students started filing out, Zahara lingered. She picked up her tray, walked to the disposal bin, and dumped it out. Not because she was done eating, because she was done swallowing the sham. They kept trying to serve her. And if Trent Whitmore was smart, he'd learned to digest the one thing he'd never tasted before today. Consequences. Zahara walked the hallways like she hadn't before. Not faster, not slower, but steadier. Each step echoed with something more than defiance. It wasn't anger, it was earned calm. And people noticed. She passed lockers where students leaned back just enough to give her space. Not the kind forced by fear, but the kind shaped by new respect. Some nodded at her. Others lowered their eyes, and a few just stared like they were seeing her for the first time. They weren't. She had always been here. They just hadn't looked. At the end of the hallway, Principal Darnell waited near his office. Zahara didn't flinch. She walked straight toward him. "Ms. Brooks," he said. "Sir, you handled yourself with grace today." "I handle myself with truth," she corrected gently. He paused, then nodded. "That too." They stood there in silence, something unspoken passing between them. Maybe it was respect. Maybe it was recognition. Maybe it was the quiet understanding between two people who had both been told they had to be twice as good for half the credit. "Dalton Heights needed to hear it," he said at last. "No," Zahara replied. "Dalton Heights needed to see it." That landed harder than either of them expected. She turned to leave. "Zahara." She looked back. "Keep leading." She didn't reply, but the look in her eyes said enough. As she stepped into her next class, the whispers followed her. But this time, they weren't laced with judgment. They were layered with questions, with curiosity, and with something close to admiration. At the back of the room, Trent Whitmore sat quietly, smaller, not quite broken, but no longer untouchable. The teacher began class, the board filled with formulas that Zahara already understood. But her mind was elsewhere. This wasn't about math. This wasn't about cafeteria tables or scholarship tags. This was about narratives and who had the right to rewrite them. Zahara Brooks had rewritten hers today, not with rage, not with revenge, but with the quiet, undeniable power of someone who finally stopped asking to be seen and made herself unignorable. But the funny thing about stories, they're never as simple as a cafeteria showdown and a walk of shame. No, not in a place like Dalton Heights. Because while Zahara moved on with calm steps and a clear head, the walls were still talking. The truth is, stories don't end when the bell rings. They fester. They echo in locker rooms, group chats, and behind closed office doors. And sometimes, if you listen close enough, you'll hear another version playing beneath the one you thought was over. So let's rewind. Not the what, but the how. Same scene, same faces. But this time, let's see it through a sharper lens, where every smirk hides a crack, every joke is a loaded weapon, and every fake smile, a punchline waiting to backfire. Dalton Heights Academy loved three things: legacy, landscaping, and lip service. The first made sure the same last names were recycled through the graduation podium year after year. The second kept the hedges pruned and perfect, as if bushes could distract from bias. And the third? Well, that's where Trent Whitmore came in. Because when you're the grandson of a donor, the rules are more like suggestions. That's why Trent strutted into the cafeteria like a trust fund wrapped in khakis. Why did he speak like a podcast host who only interviewed mirrors? And why? When Zahara Brooks walked in, skin the wrong shade, shoes the wrong brand, named the wrong family, he smelled blood. "Hey, did admissions lose a bet?" he called across the room, grinning like a crocodile at a pool party. Zahara didn't respond. Not because she couldn't, because watching him try to be clever was entertainment enough. "Guess they're just letting anyone in now," he added, elbowing his entourage of future corporate scandals. "You hear on a 2-for-1 diversity coupon," or even his friends winced. But like good little satellites, they laughed anyway. Nervous, hesitant, but they laughed. Zahara set her tray down, neatly, precisely, the calm before the clapback. Then came a line. "You think your dad bought you this seat?" she asked, voice light, almost amused. "He didn't. He rented it. And the lease is expiring." Gasps. Not dramatic movie gasps, worse. Those quiet, tight-lipped inhalations meant everyone was listening now. Trent opened his mouth, ready to respond with the confidence of a man who'd never had to earn a thing in his life. But before he could speak, Principal Darnell walked in like fate in a tailored suit. "What's going on?" the principal asked, scanning the room like a man who already knew the answer. Trent smiled. "Or tried to. Just a friendly conversation, sir." Friendly. Zahara tilted her head. That's one word for it. Bullying disguised as tradition is another. The room held its breath. Even the vending machine stopped humming, like it didn't want to miss what came next. Principal Darnell didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he spoke, even the walls paid attention. And this time, They'd finally heard enough. Principal Darnell surveyed the room like he was calculating the exact wattage of disappointment needed to roast a student alive. Trent straightened his blazer, as if starch could save him. "Sir, it was just a misunderstanding." "Oh." Darnell raised an eyebrow. "Did your mouth misunderstand your brain again?" Snickers echoed. "Not for Zahara. She didn't need to gloat. The truth was doing just fine on its own." "I was joking," Trent said, voice slipping into that polished tone reserved for fundraising dinners and court depositions. "You know, school spirit." Zahara leaned back, arms crossed, eyes steady. "You confuse school spirit with white noise," she said. "Lots of sound, no value." The cafeteria wasn't quiet, it was silent. Not the awkward kind, the charged, ready-to-blow kind. Even Ms. Connie, who usually kept to herself behind the counter, had paused mid-tater-tot scoop, watching like it was pay-per-view. Principal Darnell folded his hands. "Ms. Brooks, do you have anything else to add?" Zahara tilted her head. "Only that Trent here seems to think legacy is a resume bullet point, not a responsibility," she said. "And apparently he's been living off the Whitmore name so long, he's forgotten how to form an original thought." Someone dropped a fork. Someone else whispered, "Damn." Trent's jaw tensed. "You think you're better than me?" "No," Zahara replied. "I think I have to be, just to be considered equal." That one didn't get a gasp. It got silence. The kind that crawls up your spine and dares you to speak too soon. Principal Darnell turned to Ms. Connie. "Is that what happened?" She nodded, verbatim, and loud enough to butter the rolls. "Thank you." Darnell returned his gaze to Trent. "You know," he said, voice measured, "when I was hired here, I was told Dalton Heights valued character, not just connections." Trent squirmed. "My grandfather isn't here," Darnell cut in, "but I am. And until he rises from the grave and takes my seat, you answer to me." Then to the whole room. "Effective immediately, Mr. Whitmore will no longer be dining in the cafeteria. If you can't digest equality, you'll eat alone." And just like that, the king of Dalton's lunchroom lost his throne. No protests, no defenders, just a stunned silence and a rich boy with nowhere to sit. Zahara didn't celebrate. There were no victory laps, no slow-motion struts down the hallway. Just her tray, and a carton of milk that tasted like irony. Across the cafeteria, Trent sat alone, banished to a folding chair beside the recycling bins. From prince to peasant in under 60 seconds. His friends? No, were suddenly fascinated by their phones, their forks, the patterns on the tiles. Anything but eye contact. Funny how fast loyalty dissolves when the throne topples. Zahara sat down across from Lena Morales, who looked like she was trying not to combust from silent applause. "Girl," Lena whispered, eyes wide. "You just flipped the table without even raising your voice." Zahara shrugged. "I just told the truth." Lena smirked. "Exactly. And it burned." Zahara picked at her food. It looked the same, smelled the same, but tasted different. Maybe because, for the first time, she wasn't eating in someone else's shadow. Still, there was no joy in watching Trent squirm. Only clarity. Because behind every fake laugh he used to throw her way was something worse than cruelty. It was fear, not of her, but of what she represented. That his bloodline wasn't enough anymore. That someone like her could not only exist at Dalton Heights, but also challenge the hierarchy and win. That scared people like him. And Zahara knew it wouldn't stop here. Legacy didn't die quietly. It regrouped. It retaliated. It's called Mommy. It scheduled a meeting with the board. So no, she wasn't celebrating. She was calculating. Lena leaned closer. "You think he'll come back for round 2? Zahara nodded. "He will. But next time, he won't come alone. He'll use policies, whispers, and influence. That's how they fight when power slips out of their hands." Lena exhaled. "So what now?" Zahara stared at the wall across the cafeteria, the honor roll plaques, the student of the month photos, the laminated illusions of fairness. "What now?" she echoed. "Now I stop surviving Dalton," she said, standing up, picking up her tray like it was a shield. "I start redesigning it." And as she walked past Trent Whitmore, still silent, still stunned, she didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She just looked him in the eye, nodded once, and whispered the line that finally turned the tables. Thanks for the platform. Dalton Heights liked to pretend it was neutral. A merit-based institution, they called it, where effort was everything, and privilege was purely coincidental. Of course, that was easy to say when the last 7 valedictorians shared 3 surnames and a grandfather on the board. Zahara knew better. After lunch, the school tried to reset. Teachers smiled a little too widely. Hall monitors loitered like unpaid bodyguards. The drama teacher even called her brave in the hallway, like she'd just escaped a war zone instead of surviving Tuesday. But nothing had actually changed. Not yet, because while Trent was busy licking his wounds, the real players were already moving. Emails were flying. Meetings were being scheduled. Somewhere in the main office, a printer was churning out policy documents about campus discourse and appropriate language guidelines. Translation: they were preparing to protect the institution, not the student. Principal Darnell, to his credit, hadn't flinched. But Zahara knew how these things worked. He might have thrown the match, but the board controlled the fuse box. In Ms. Langley's English class, she caught a whisper behind her. "She's the reason we're getting mandatory bias training." Zahara didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The voice belonged to a sophomore who once said microaggression was a made-up word and thought colorblind was a compliment. 2 rows up, someone else muttered, "I miss the old Dalton." Zahara almost laughed. "The old Dalton? You mean the one that clapped for charity cases as long as they kept quiet?" Lena passed her a folded note. "Not some sappy you okay? Nonsense, just 5 words." They blinked first. "Don't stop." And she wouldn't. Because this wasn't just about cafeteria jabs or a band bully. This was about the machinery, the polite racism, the subtle quotas. The language is dressed up in fit, culture, and tradition. Dalton didn't need a new diversity pamphlet. It needed a reckoning. And if Zahara had to be the scalpel, so be it. As the bell rang and students shuffled out, she lingered, watching, listening. The whispers were still there, but now they sounded more like concern than cruelty. The system hadn't fallen, but it had cracked. And Zahara Brooks? She knew exactly where to press next. The next day, Dalton Heights issued a school-wide email. Subject line: upholding our values. It opened with the usual academic fluff: respect, community, dialogue. Words that sounded meaningful until you realized they'd been copy-pasted from every PR crisis template since 1998. Zahara read it while sipping her orange juice. By now, she could predict every sentence before it arrived. We strive to create a welcoming environment. We do not tolerate discrimination in any form. Let this be a learning opportunity. Of course, nowhere in the email was her name mentioned, nor Trent's, just the generic language of institutional self-preservation. But Zahara wasn't looking for acknowledgement. Not from them. Not anymore. What mattered came later. Quiet, subtle, but unmistakable. A freshman girl with box braids who had never dared sit at Zahara's table before slid into the seat beside her. "I like what you said," she mumbled, eyes on her tray. Zahara smiled. "Which part?" "All of it." Later, 2 seniors, one white, one Latina, nodded at her in the hallway. Not a pity nod, not a good-for-you smile, just recognition, like she was finally occupying space. They could no longer pretend she didn't deserve it. And Trent? Trent walked the halls like a deflated parade balloon, too quiet, too careful. His swagger had taken a sabbatical, and his entourage had found other gravitational centers to orbit. Poetic justice? Almost. But Zahara didn't need him ruined. She needed him irrelevant. Principal Darnell stopped her outside the library. "Just so you know," he said, "the board's not thrilled." She raised an eyebrow. "And you?" He smiled faintly. "I don't work for them." That was all she needed to hear. As she walked away, Zahara passed the honor roll wall again. Her name wasn't on it yet, but it would be. Not because she kept her head down. Not because she played nicely. Not because she swallowed their insults with a forced smile. But because she stood up. And now, the school that once called her a guest had no choice but to treat her like a resident. Permanent, loud, and absolutely not going anywhere. But even as the noise faded and the walls finally stopped whispering her name, Zahara knew something deeper had begun to shift. It wasn't just the way students looked at her now. It was the way she looked at herself. Because sometimes the biggest change doesn't come from a confrontation in the cafeteria or an email sent to the entire school. Sometimes it comes later, quietly, when no one's watching. That moment when you realize you're not just surviving the system anymore. You're starting to believe, deep down, that you were never the problem. And for Zahara Brooks, that belief didn't just change her lunch period. It began to change everything. There are days that don't feel like turning points until they do. Zahara Brooks didn't wake up that morning expecting the world to shift. She tied her scarf like always, folded her schedule into the front pocket of her backpack like always, looked in the mirror, held her breath, and reminded herself, you belong here. Like always, Dalton Heights wasn't made for girls like her. Not the way it was made for the Trents of the world. Boys who had buildings named after their grandfathers and confidence stitched into their uniforms. She wasn't born into that kind of legacy. Hers was the kind you build, brick by brick, with scraped knees and silenced dreams. But today, the silence cracked. It happened, as always, in the cafeteria, where seats weren't assigned, but everyone knew who belonged where. Laughter could be friendly or fatal, depending on who it was aimed at. Zahara had just found her seat, far corner, beside the window no one liked, when she heard it. Oh, look, Trent Whitmore's voice floated across the room. Charity's back on the menu. The words landed softly, like feathers dipped in venom. Zahara didn't flinch. She'd heard worse. Much worse. But something inside her, something tired, something brave, refused to stay quiet this time. She stood, not in anger, not for spectacle, but because her spine had been carrying too many unspoken truths for too long. I'm not your punchline, Trent, she said, voice steady. And I'm not your guest. The room froze. Trent chuckled, but the laughter didn't spread. Not this time. Zahara's eyes scanned the room. So many faces. Some surprised. Some uncomfortable. A few curious. I didn't come here for permission, she continued. I came here for a purpose. And just like that, her voice broke through the wall they'd all learned to tiptoe around. The cafeteria didn't erupt. It leaned in, because for the first time in a long time, someone was speaking, not to win but to heal. There's something sacred about stillness. The moment right after courage enters a room. Zahara stood in that stillness. Not as a rebel, not as a hero, just as herself. And for once, that was enough. Trent, still seated, blinked like someone who had just been spoken to in a language he'd never cared to learn. His smirk faltered, not from fear, but from confusion. This wasn't how the scene was supposed to go. He mocked. She swallowed. The crowd chuckled. The hierarchy held. But not today. I earned my place here, Zahara continued, her voice calm but certain. Not because of a name on a wall. Not because of a donation. Because I refused to believe I didn't belong. She looked at him, not to hurt, not to shame, but to hold accountable. I don't want your table, Trent. I want to build my own. Someone in the back coughed. A chair creaked. Then came a first real shift. A girl from the robotics team, quiet, often overlooked, nodded. A freshman near the water fountain lowered her phone and watched, eyes wide. Even Miss Connie behind the food counter paused, hand resting gently on the serving spoon. Zahara didn't need applause. She just needed witnesses. Because what she was saying wasn't just for her. It was for every student who had ever sat through a joke that wasn't funny. Every eye roll dismissed potential. Every whisper that turned confidence into doubt. And maybe, just maybe, for every teacher who had looked the other way, thinking silence was safer than justice. Principal Darnell entered just as her last words landed. He didn't interrupt. He stood near the door, arms crossed, listening like a man who'd been waiting a long time for someone else to say what he couldn't. Trent shifted in his seat. It was just a joke, he muttered. Zahara turned. No, it was a mirror. You just didn't like the reflection. The strange thing about courage? It's contagious. Zahara didn't know it then, but her voice had cracked open something far bigger than one confrontation. Something that had been waiting in the shadows, quiet but alive. By the end of lunch, the cafeteria didn't return to normal, because normal had just been redefined. Students didn't laugh as loudly at Trent's muttered insults. A few shifted away from his table entirely. And when Zahara returned to her seat, she didn't sit alone. Lena Morales slid beside her, tray in hand, like it had always been that way. You know, Lena said softly, I wanted to say something to him since sophomore year, but I didn't know how. Zahara blinked. Why didn't you? Lena shrugged. Because I thought no one would stand with me. Zahara looked around. The cafeteria wasn't clapping. It wasn't cheering. But it was watching, listening. You're not alone, Zahara said. You never were. You just didn't know it yet. A few minutes later, a boy from the chess club, Eli, always quiet, always polite, walked past her table. He didn't say a word, but he nodded slowly, firmly. The kind of nod that says thank you for speaking when I couldn't. And in that moment, something changed. Zahara realized she hadn't just reclaimed her voice. She'd become a lighthouse. The kind that doesn't move, doesn't chase, but stands tall so others can find their way. Across the room, Trent sat frozen. Not furious, not vengeful, just confused, like a king whose subjects had suddenly discovered they could choose their own crown. Principal Darnell watched it all unfold from near the vending machine, arms folded. He didn't interfere. He didn't need to. Some lessons, he knew, were more powerful when they came from within. As the bell rang and students began to leave, one girl, tiny, glasses too big for her face, paused at Zahara's table. You're the reason I'm going to try out for student council, she whispered, then scurried away like she'd said too much. Zahara sat back, her tray mostly untouched, and for the first time in a long time, she felt full. Change sounds beautiful in theory, but in reality, it's heavy. By the time Zahara reached her afternoon class, the weight of the cafeteria lingered on her shoulders like an invisible backpack, not filled with books, but with stares, whispers, and something even louder than both, expectations. Because now, they weren't just watching her. They were waiting. Waiting for her to speak again. Waiting for her to lead. Waiting for her to be the voice they never found in themselves. And that terrified her more than anything Trent Whitmore had ever said. She took her seat near the window, trying to shrink herself back into the quiet. But silence, once broken, is hard to rebuild, especially when it echoes through a place that used to treat you like furniture, present, functional, but never meant to move. Ms. Langley, her English teacher, glanced up and paused mid-roll call. Zahara, she said gently, we were just about to discuss today's essay prompt. What does power look like? A few students shifted in their seats. Zahara felt every eye land on her. She cleared her throat. Power looks like choice, she said slowly. It's the choice to speak when silence is easier. The choice to be seen, even if people would rather look away. The room held still. Sometimes, she continued, power isn't about leading a crowd. It's about being the first person to stop pretending everything's fine. Ms. Langley nodded, eyes soft. Would you mind writing that down for the bulletin? Zahara blinked. Why? Because it belongs up there. Zahara hesitated. She didn't feel like a quote on a wall. She didn't feel like a symbol. She felt like a girl who had just survived the longest lunch period of her life. But maybe surviving was enough for today. After class, she found Lena waiting at her locker. You okay? Lena asked. Zahara exhaled. Honestly? I don't know. Lena smiled. Good. That means you're still real. And Zahara realized something. She didn't have to be fearless. She just had to be true. And sometimes that was more than enough to shake an entire system. By the end of the week, Zahara's name was no longer whispered. It was remembered. Not in gossip, not in ridicule, but in respect. She didn't win a medal. No one handed her a certificate for courage. The school didn't rename a hallway or print her face on a poster. But something bigger happened. Students, quiet ones, invisible ones, started showing up. Not louder, but truer. A girl in AP Physics who never spoke in class raised her hand. A student who always sat alone started a petition for inclusive school events. Even a teacher who'd once avoided eye contact now called out casual jokes for what they were. Not because Zahara told them to, but because she showed them how. One afternoon, Principal Darnell called her into his office. Not for discipline, for something else. He handed her a sealed envelope. thick, heavy. She opened it slowly. Inside, a personal letter from the board. Zahara read every word twice. They didn't apologize. Of course not. But they acknowledged. Quietly. Carefully. Enough. And then, the last paragraph. It is voices like yours that remind us why this institution must continue evolving. She folded the letter, slipped it into her backpack, not for proof, but for memory. As she stepped outside into the soft light of late afternoon, she saw Trent sitting alone under the old oak tree. Not sulking, not glaring, just thinking. And for the first time, she didn't feel anger toward him. She felt hope. Maybe not for him, but for the world that raised him. Because if Zahara Brooks had learned anything through it all, it was this. Bravery isn't about fighting back. It's about showing up anyway, even when you're outnumbered, even when you're underestimated, even when they try to make you small. She walked down the stone steps of Dalton Heights Academy, not tall but lighter, because she didn't just find her place. She created it, and every student who came after her would know. They didn't have to shrink to fit the space. The space would grow to fit them. Some battles are fought with fists, others with voices. Zahara didn't change the world overnight, but she changed the room she was in. And sometimes, that's where real revolutions begin. Because standing up for yourself doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like holding your tray and holding your ground. It looks like not laughing along. It looks like saying, "This is who I am, and I belong." The lesson? Power doesn't come from legacy or privilege. It comes from the truth, from courage, and from choosing to speak even when your voice shakes. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you of a time you stayed quiet, or a time you didn't, let stay with you. Let push you to listen louder, to lead gently, to rise bolder. And if you believe in stories that give power back to the ones who were told to stay small, subscribe to Story Precious, where every story is a stand, and every voice matters.